This lo-fi beat sucks, but I didn't always feel that way. You see, I've been making lo-fi for around 4 years now, and this was one of the first tracks that I made that I actually felt really proud of. At the time, I found myself thinking, there's no way I'm ever gonna make a track this good again. Thankfully, I was wrong. We're gonna give it a listen in all of its poorly aged glory, and I'm gonna walk you guys through everything that I would have done differently had I known everything that I know now. So, without further ado, this is Don't Come Back by Middle January. It was really that vocal run that I was like, oh, I got something special here. That bass sound was like the only bass I had. That shaker is just so awful. The idea is there. Nice little break there, right? I mean, I was cooking. I had a little bit of something going on. So fortunately or unfortunately, I actually still have the original project file. I just lost a few audio samples, like I think like a crack-a-lacature loop and then a couple of snaps and percussion things, but the core of it's still there. So I want to take a look at some of the elements, some of the mistakes I made, and then possibly even try to dive in and see what adjustments we can make to bring this a little bit more up to the level that I feel like I'm at now. If we take a peek, it's a very simple project file. That's the first thing that's going to jump out at you. There are very, very few layers. A lot of that has to do with the fact that compared to my usual, more recent stuff, I only use drum and percussion loops here. I didn't lay down any of my own drums. I wasn't really very confident in coming up with drum patterns, and of course L-Dre is like the drum guy. So I just grabbed an L-Dre drum loop and dropped that onto a melody I came up with. And you know, no shade to L-Dre, it's just that like, when you have individual drum sounds, it's a lot easier to mix your project. You can sidechain to the kick and not the snare. You can get your hi-hats leveled a little bit better, and then you can EQ things separately. So I didn't have any opportunity to do any of that. I just kind of took what I got and dropped it right in the project. And all I did to that was just a little bit of a low shelf cut to bring that kick in a little bit here. Nice swingy little kind of old school boom bappy. This is the first layer that really jumps out to me is like something I would never use now, is this really high shaker loop. It's got a ton of like really high harsh textures. We layer that up with drums. Again, not talking shade to L-Dre. This just isn't necessarily my style. I like things a little bit warmer, a little bit softer. I probably wouldn't be reaching for this loop in my collection these days. Fortunately, I did change that up in the next section with a little bit more of a simple hi-hat loop, also from L-Dre. Really locks into that hip-hop feel. I was pretty happy with how that all came together, to be honest. And then initially in the song, I had some snaps layered up with some snares here and there, just to give it a little bit more dimension. I thought that actually sounded pretty good, all things considered. Of course, everything I was doing was with cymatics and L-Dre basically at the time, so I had this like playground ambience going on through a lot of, but not the entire track. That's where we got that little "Don't Come Back" thing at the end here. And that's how I named the song. But let's get into the meat and potatoes of this thing. The main chords of this song, believe it or not, are a free contact guitar VST. You might know me as a guy that adds guitar to all of my lo-fi beats. This was made at a time where I was not confident enough to even record my own guitar. I literally have learned to play guitar since I made this song, just to give you a little bit of an idea of how far along we've come since this was made. So I actually do like the chord progression. I hate the sound. So right out of the gate, I think something that I would do to kind of instantly make this better is just pick a better foundational sound for this, right? Like a Rhodes or a piano with some nice like delay and a reverb, because this is just a pretty harsh start to the track. It might be a good piece for like an intro or a B section, but to have this going throughout, I think it gets pretty fatiguing on the ears, is what it sounds like by itself. So all I did to those Did a little bit of EQing to make it this kind of like telephone filter effect. And I did have Valhalla Supermassive at the time. This is still very much in my repertoire on the cloud, the Magellan. I've got it mixed to 100% just directly on the dry signal, so there's just like no dry strum coming through. I think honestly this like filter and the huge reverb really did make it pretty hard to tell that it was this kind of crappy VST guitar. I think that was a big part of what I was trying to do at the time, was basically hide that I was using a crappy free VST guitar, trying to turn it into a new sound. I doubled that with a low and a high part to give it a nice big size. Shout out to Pass Me for that move. Once again, a telephone filter shifted to match the frequency, in this case for the high part. We got fancy with a gross beat on the tremolo setting, giving it that nice wave. And then fruity delay bank on who knows what preset here. Just adding a nice little bit of space to that thing. So without any of the plugins, this is what we've got. So you can hear there's a lot of high stuff that I took out of there that just would sound awful. And then with the tremolo and the reverb, we get something a little bit bigger. So while that's playing in the intro with our cymatics sound, we've got the first introduction of the piece that I thought made this track, and it's this, once again, cymatics. Just kind of like reverse chopped up vocal that I found in the Eternity pack, I guess. These are all probably super old packs. I don't really keep up with the cymatics packs anymore these days, but I was a fiend for them when I was first getting started. So if you're super new, I actually definitely recommend checking them out. What I did here with these nice little vocal chops is I basically found, I think like 2, 3, I guess 4 individual chops and rotated between them and then kind of forward and reverse. So through the intro, yeah, so I've got them both reversed, so they're kind of like swelling rather than fading out. And I feel like that was like basically my transition sound. It ended up being kind of a main melody that I used here. And then as we come back out, we've got them playing forward in the drop. So they just kind of lock it into this like weird, I don't know, vocal lo-fi space. So we can go listen to the intro one more time. I hate those guitar sounds. You heard that beautiful bass sound here in this first drop. This is maybe the biggest problem with this mix by itself. It's just this like godforsaken bass tone. Once again, shout out to those free Kontakt plugins. We've got the upright bass from the factory selection, the Kontakt factory selection. So I just absolutely abused this thing with an EQ. I boosted the low mids, left the subs alone, and then just did a huge high cut. Because without that, there's like a bunch of plucky sounds, if I recall correctly. So, you know, at least I did a little bit of sound design with it. So the final 2 layers were this like piano melody I had going on and then another VST guitar. So let's pop into this piano. I think this actually sounds okay. The mix could use some work. I've got some weird phasing going on with the EQ, but I like the line that I laid down at least. So we've got this nice glissando upwards. I'm sure I clicked that in because, oh, did I? I don't know. No, yeah, I totally did. Look at that. Look at the velocities. Of course I clicked that in, dude. So I clicked a little glissando in and then, you know, laid some keys down. So really it's like this nice complementary motion with the chord progression. It's hitting nicely, it's kind of got these lead-ins. It's not the worst thing I've ever come up with. That was a big reason I was so proud of it. I felt like all the pieces were kind of working together despite maybe not being mixed super well. And then finally we've got this guitar layer, which is just some strums on that Labs Peel guitar. I've got none of the reverb turned up on it here. And then I ran it through FL Studio's free amp emulator to try to make it feel like a real guitar, even though it very clearly is not, and then did some pretty harsh EQing once again, introducing tons of phasing issues and trying to shape the sound a little bit to fit into the mix as best as I could. You kind of heard that playing there. That's pretty much the whole thing. So rather than try to go through and like fix every mistake I made, I think I'll just talk about how we could rescue the problems that we have and try to turn it into at least a slightly better mix here. So without, adding new layers or adjusting any of the MIDI parts or even changing the instrument parts, I'm gonna see what we can do to this mix and try to get it a little bit closer to where I would like a mix to be myself, right? So let's start off with maybe the loudest part of the song here, with this like kind of piano coming in and the chord thing going on. So one of the problems is that the chord and the piano melody are a little bit clashing. They're not always writing the same chords. That's its own issue that I will not be addressing here, but you'll have to bear with me as we listen to it a few times. So we're gonna take a look at that piano part here. Running it through the hardcore is maybe not the move in all cases. So let's see what that sounds like without it. Yeah, it sounds like the hardcore is mostly just adding a bunch of distortion, which is kind of bring it up an octave. So if we just turn the hardcore off and let the natural sound of what is actually a pretty nice piano VST. It's the original's firewood piano, modeled after Jeremiah Freitz's piano from Lumineers, one of my favorite bands. Shout out to those guys. Really like the tone of this one by itself, so I don't really see the need to beat it up too bad. So we're just gonna turn hardcore off. No reason to run a piano through an amp emulator. Sound Godizer, it's just basically compressing, basically like a Maximus instance on this A preset, whatever it happens to be doing. A little bit of compression, maybe a little bit of like high EQ boosting going on. So if we do without that. Doing a good job giving it some volume here. This is where I think we're getting a lot of our issues. Now, the telephone filter is an important thing in this mix. It's giving it its identity in a way, so I don't want to like completely abandon it, but if we did hear it without that, this is what we end up with. It's a pretty nice sound. So I actually think I want to bring some of those highs back in and let some of those textures shine through a bit more. And we're losing a lot of information in that low end of the run. So I've decided to go the other way with the EQ, where before I was kind of boosting a lot of the mids and doing a hard cut. I've switched to a more gentle cut and cutting some of those like high mids out to kind of try to tame some of the harshness while having it up the octave to let it cut through a bit more. So let's see how that sounds in context. Could still use a little bit of volume, so I'm going to break out an old favorite here with the OTT and bring that depth way down to like, I don't know, 20% and bump that up by 8 dB. Let's see how that sounds. Just bump that before the EQ so we're not to bring out too much texture up above the EQ after the fact. I think that smooths it out, and that's feeling pretty present now. So moving on to the bass sound. Once again, we're not changing any sounds because I think that's going to end up turning into a bit of a nightmare. But let's maybe chill out on some of these EQ choices here. So. In this case, instead of doing that big, huge boost around like 300 Hertz, what I'm gonna do is bring the Destructor, or like any distortion plugin that you please, and put it on something, not too aggressive, but something with a little bit of bite to it, to try to add a bunch of harmonics to give it that like crunch, and then we're gonna take that out, smooth it out. That'll give it the presence in the mix without having these like weird volume changes and phasing issues that you get with crazy EQ curves like I had there. So let's go with like soft sat, nice gentle. So then another thing you notice is there's that like kind of really aggressive percussive sound right at the beginning of it. So what I'm gonna do is throw on a free transient shaper, kilohertz. Highly recommend you grab this. We're gonna bring that attack down a good bit, try to get rid of some of that percussiveness in that. So now we're sitting. And the volume's also all over the place, so let's throw on a nice visual compressor here. So that's gonna thicken the bass up. It's gonna make it much more even, feel a lot more sustained rather than being like jumping up, jumping down, jumping up. It's gonna make you feel less tempted to turn it really high in the mix so that you can feel those moments that you want it to stand out where you might have made it super loud like I did in this case. While we're here, might as well tackle the guitar next, right? So we've got two guitars like I mentioned earlier. You've got the low and the high. Again, not changing any notes or the plugins themselves, but let's go ahead and make this cue a little bit less aggressive here, probably on both fronts. So let's just listen to those. So in both cases, I ended up ducking some of the weird like boosts I had for no reason in the middle of the telephone, and I just kind of softened out the high pass filter. I kept it kind of aggressive, or softened out the low pass filter and kept it kind of aggressive high pass on both. I'm not generally super afraid of having one end be a little bit more aggressive than the other, but I think to like really cram them both in, you're just asking for trouble with phasing issues, especially with like a non-linear EQ like the Fruity Parametric EQ. So this is already kind of rounding the sound out a little bit nicer. We're introducing a little bit more lows and kind of taming those highs a little bit here. There we go, yeah. I'm gonna leave the tremolo alone. I don't think it's hurting the sound in any way too badly. And then, once again, I don't think the delay is... I actually don't think the delay is necessary. I think the delay might be kind of overcrowding things at this point. So I'm just gonna turn that delay off, leave the grow speed alone, adjust the EQ, and give it a listen in the mix and see what we have to adjust from here. All right, let's hop into this guitar melody part now. So we're on the Labs Peel guitar 2. Yeah, maybe we'll play around with this a little bit and see if we can get this dialed in a little bit better here. So once again, all these aggressive weird EQs, generally not the most necessary thing. I'm sure there was a reason I was up to it. I bet there's some harshness in here, but I want to tame that with something a little bit more sophisticated in this case. Yeah, okay. So we did the EQing on the amp emulator. I wouldn't really recommend this amp emulator for most cases, though. If you do want to know how to make a decent guitar tone, you can check out this video that I made here. But in a lot of cases, you get an even better free amp emulator. But we're gonna work with it because it's what I chose at the time. So we got that EQ going on. I was trying to tame these kind of aggressive peaks here, so rather than doing it just kind of whole cloth through the entire sound and ended up making some kind of weird emptiness and weird like spaces, what I like to do these days is throw on a dynamic EQ. So if we look at, I was looking at something like 632 hertz. So I got a 4-band dynamic. I'm gonna throw that on 632. I'm gonna turn that threshold way on down here. This is exactly why I learned to play guitar, by the way, so I didn't have to deal with these terrible sounds. But I think that's helping a little bit. So that's something for now. Let's also throw a little compression on this guy. Try to even it out a bit so that our mix isn't so jumpy. bring all these down nice and tight, I guess. Starting to smooth out a little bit, and then let's run this to a new reverb rather than that terrible one. Just to stick with the theme of the time, when we assume I had very few plugins, I'll throw on a fruity reverb too, only wet signal. Let's give it some good size. Bump that decay just a little bit. Route to this track. So, you know, obviously you can't completely rescue a bad sound. That's where sound selection is going to be really important, but even assuming that we were stuck with this sound for some reason, like I'm forcing myself to be right now, you can do a little bit to work with it. It just ends up taking a lot of extra effort. One more thing to kind of try to tackle here is these these vocal chops. So let's have a listen, see what we can do to improve them. Fruity reverb, and telephone filter. I don't mind the EQ action. The reverb's not my favorite in the world, but I think we're okay. I think the biggest thing this actually needs is just some good compression. Especially for that washed out feeling I was going for, it makes sense to have it be like super glued. A vinyl, if you like go on like the Library of Congress, for example, and you listen to like super old vinyls, there's not a ton of dynamics just because that literally gets worn out of the record. So compressing something that you're trying to make feel old and worn out makes a lot of sense. Give it a good hard compress. So I think we're gonna have to do the same thing to the verse chops. Let's have a listen. Sure thing. So let me just actually take the same preset here and dial it in. Man, that sounds not that bad. Finally, clean up this godforsaken shaker loop. I did nothing to it, like a fool. Let's just see if we can turn it down a little bit. So yeah, I dropped it down 2 half steps, so now it's a lower pitch to begin with. Should have a little bit less harshness going on. That's beautiful. I'm just gonna straight up roll off the lows and then duck those highs a little bit gently in the first instance, a little bit less gently. Start rounding that out a little bit more. That's so much more tolerable now. And then I'm just gonna turn them down a tiny bit here. Widen them out. When I said a tiny bit, I meant 8.5 decibels, I guess, so that they just feel a little more like a background texture. And that's just relative to the drums here. You notice that everything else silent. So I wanted to make sure my drum mix is dialed in before I hear it in the rest of the track. Let's see if it's drowned out now. So yeah, a lot of times when you add something like this was a problem I had a lot at the time that I was making this track, is like you'll add a new element and you'd be like, oh, I can't hear that new element that I added quite as much. Let me turn it up, get it, you know, situated just right, and then you just leave it way louder than it should be in the mix. Where if you're like making sure everything's mixed relative to each other in a sensible manner, obviously the shaker loop is part of the percussion, so having it mixed relative to the drums is a good thing to keep in mind. And then you want to make sure it fits into the mix with the other elements you got going on. So I like mixing things isolated and then also all together. Pan, stereo, you know, try it all basically. I think I'm gonna leave the LJ drum loop alone, honestly. I might actually, I know I just said I'm gonna leave it alone, and now I'm not gonna. Yeah, I'm gonna throw, just because I am using so I just ducked around 3000 hertz to try to soften the snare out specifically, leave pretty much everything else alone though. So So normally, of course, I'd want to like sidechain the kick to the bass because I'm not adding new drums. I'm just not going to bother with that at this time. I could probably go ahead and like chop these all up and like, you know, route them in a mixer channel and then sidechain. And in fact, that's probably what I would do if like, or making this song right now and I really love this drum loop for some reason. But I am not going to do that right now because I don't feel like it. So I'm just going to turn the vocals down the tiniest bit, and then I just decided I want a nice reverb pad to help tie everything all together here. So let's go ahead and throw Valhalla Supermassive. Send the chops to it. Send both guitars to it, why not? Good, I'm gonna bring that way down, way wide. Preemptively EQ out the lows. Nice gentle roll off here, and then I'm gonna duck some of the highs from that guitar coming in. See what that does to the ambiance here. There's always room to improve. You can work forever on a mix, but at least now with a little bit of basically just compression, EQ, and a couple of different choices as far as like where I want instruments to sit and like what creative effects I've decided to use in this case. You can really improve a mix with some very simple, you know, thinking basically. Just don't do anything too extreme and kind of trust the sounds you're using. And then of course, this thing would be like a billion times better if we swapped the sounds out or just kind of remade it from scratch. So if you guys would be interested in seeing me completely remake this beat, leave a comment. I'll be happy to oblige. But for now, that's all I got. Thanks for stopping by. See you next week. Peace.